I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. Indonesia held its presidential election back in February, and the inauguration is fast approaching on October 20th. Here to share what it will mean for the country going forward is RANE's Asia-Pacific analyst, Nate Fischler. Hi, Nate. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Can you start by giving a basic review of the results of the election?
Sure. So the winner ended up being the defense minister, Prabowo Subianto. It was a while ago, back in February, so it's an 8-month transition period. He came away with a fairly convincing win, garnering a high 50s, 58% or so of the vote, defeating two high-profile opponents. So this gives him a sort of a strong mandate coming into his term. It is the case also that his election victory was questioned by the losing candidates. They actually brought a complaint to the Constitutional Court alleging fraud, voter intimidation, misuse of state resources in order to forward his candidacy. However, the courts found insufficient evidence to substantiate these claims. And there will not be further legal constraints on Prabowo's ascent to the presidency come October 20th. However, they did draw some localized and small-scale protests. It highlighted a sector of Indonesian society that is worried about democratic backsliding in the country. And So his victory, while convincing, it does cause trepidation among some, and we can speak to that a little later because it has to do with his association with the outgoing president.
So Subianto will come in with a reasonably strong mandate. Can you go over his policy agenda?
Yeah, well, he's a very interesting figure. This is the third time he ran for president. He was defeated by the outgoing president, Jokowi, Joko Jokowi Widodo, or better known as Jokowi, in 2014 and 2019. And in those elections, he had a very strong national security, military focus, Indonesian sovereignty, basically a nationalistic campaign, or two of them in 2014 and 2019. Interestingly, in this time around in 2024, he totally rebranded himself, and he moved away from what had before been a rather confrontational and firebrand sort of persona into someone more focused on expanding the social safety net, social welfare, food security. His flagship domestic policy is to provide free school lunches for the tens of millions of Indonesian school children that are spread around 6,000 inhabited islands. So that is no small task for the central government to provide meals to all school children, but that is what he's going with. So food security is very strong. Expanding the social safety net is very strong. He did keep with his long-running theme of military modernization and increased military spending, and emphasizing Indonesia's sovereignty in the context of regional geopolitics. Although that was a little subdued relative to his prior campaigns, but we can definitely expect, given his history as first of all, as Jokowi's defense minister the last 5 years, and a long military career prior to that, we can expect a deeper emphasis on the ongoing military modernization program in Indonesia that he has overseen for the last 5 years. So he will strengthen this, and the assets, the military modernization agenda that he and Jokowi are in agreement on. I mean, his ambitions in this regard go deeper. So we can expect that to be stronger.
There's been also some controversy both around Subianto's election and the role of the legislature. with both tied to political and social unrest risk. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we alluded to that at the beginning a little bit. So the controversy is basically around a de facto alliance that Prabowo and the outgoing Jokowi made with each other. So as I mentioned, the two of them are formerly very bitter rivals. They made peace when Jokowi invited Prabowo into his cabinet as defense minister for his final term. And since then, the two of them have come together basically to seed the entire Indonesian system with their influence. And so this has to give an example. Probably the biggest example is that Prabowo's vice president, and this is very important, is going to be Jokowi's son. Likely in a quid pro quo or some type of cooperative understanding. Jokowi's son, Gibran Raka, is currently 36 or 35. The law he was too young to run for vice president under the Indonesian law, but he was given an age exemption in order to be on Prabowo's ticket, and the person who gave the age exemption is a former chief justice on the Constitutional Court, who is also Jokowi's brother-in-law. So we see a lot of familial ties here. Jokowi's son, Gibran Raka, being the next vice president, positions him naturally to be the next president after Prabowo. And then, that's not the only case. Jokowi also sought an age exemption for his youngest son to run for the governor of Jakarta. That bid failed ultimately, but he's placed other family members and family confidants in positions of power, including the heads of political parties, seats in parliament, and then important governorships, like he has an ally running for the governor of North Sumatra, and because his youngest son will not be able to run for the governor of Jakarta, he has a different ally positioned to contend for that role. And then at the same time, he appointed Prabowo's nephew to his cabinet earlier this year. And Prabowo himself has deep ties to the intelligence and military establishments in Indonesia, and his brother is among the business elite in the country. So we have basically two personalistic power bases that have mutually enhanced each other in the pursuit of the presidency and beyond. So what this means is, speaking a little bit to concerns about democratic backsliding in the country, the critics of these two are worried about nepotism and about skirting rules, skirting regulations, even circumventing the judiciary when they need to. And their power, in the last year and a half, when they've been seeding all of this and placing all of these people in strategic and influential positions. Yeah, this is really what the controversy is all about. And then this sort of came to a head on August 22nd. I already referred to this case, but when Jokowi sought an age exemption for his youngest son to run as the Jakarta governor, the court said no, and then he had the legislature, which he also wields significant influence over, vote to overturn that decision and thus allow his son to run. This was only stopped by violent protests that turned unruly and violent, and an attempt to storm the parliament building on August 22nd that delayed this measure and effectively made it so that Jokowi's youngest son will not be Jakarta governor this time around. But the important implication to draw from this is, to my knowledge, the only thing that has stopped these two from, taking inches of more and more power and influence over the system broadly was this violent protest on August 22nd. It effectively stopped the overturning of the Constitutional Court decision. So you have the protest risk, and this will be further stoked by the fact that it worked, and nothing else has. So further efforts to sort of undermine the judiciary by Prabowo or by Jokowi or his son or their allies, the network more broadly, definitely risks more social unrest risk down the line. And then political risk, of course, is that the separation of powers are being blurred here. Jokowi is leaving with, I think, a 63% majority in the two houses of the legislature, and then we've also had legislative elections, and Prabowo will have an 81% supermajority at least. There might be other parties still to join this coalition. So there's going to be the legislature, in some ways, in a lot of ways, has folded into the executive branch in the last few years, and that will continue under Prabowo. And then those two branches, like in the August 22 case that I was just discussing, those two branches could then team up to clash with the judiciary. And this could, in a low likelihood but very high impact scenario, could bring about a full-blown constitutional crisis in the country. So these dynastic ambitions certainly come with some risk. Yeah.
It sounds like the association or alliance with outgoing President Jokowi was in some ways critical to Subianto's victory. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is the outgoing president's role in all of this, and what is the impact going to be on policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, Jokowi, despite everything I've just said, he's very unpopular among certain sectors of society. But broadly speaking, he had consistently very high approval rating. He's going to leave office with a high approval rating. He's a very popular figure. And therefore, given Prabowo's two previous failed presidential bids, and his controversial past and his character, made the association with Jokowi pretty crucial to his eventual presidential win. So without Jokowi, in my view at least, it's unlikely that Prabowo would have prevailed here. And therefore, he's tied himself to the hip with Jokowi. And then Jokowi's plans, as touched on a little bit, so he served the constitutionally mandated limit of 2 5-year terms. Early on, he sought to amend the Constitution, or he at least probed that idea so that he could stay on for a third term, and eventually abandoning it. But instead, the idea he got was to place his son as the most likely next president following Prabowo. And so he's going to be very much involved in Indonesian politics for the foreseeable future. And from a policy perspective, it's also a very high likelihood that Prabowo promising a large degree of policy continuity was a prerequisite for Jokowi teaming up with him. So from a policy perspective, this means at least in the first year or two, very strong domestic policy continuity between the Jokowi and the Prabowo administrations. This the highest profile domestic policy there would be Jokowi's resource nationalism, which, broadly speaking, bans the export of raw materials like nickel, bauxite, copper to some extent, and in order to force foreign investors to invest in refining in the country, in order to develop the Indonesian industrial base and eventually develop entire industry cycles in the country, to move it up the manufacturing value chain. So the biggest example of that is EV batteries. So they have the nickel for it. They want to develop the entire EV battery supply chain in Indonesia and are making laws to the effect that compel foreign investors to cooperate with that scheme if they want to be involved in those sectors in Indonesia. So we'll see a continuation of the resource nationalism policy, possibly an extension, because Prabowo is quite keen on Indonesian self-sufficiency and the like. So we could see this expand to bans or restrictions on more exports of raw materials like gold, palm oil, energy resources like oil and gas. So basically a very protectionist economic policy that Jokowi was very deep into, and Prabowo will continue. On foreign policy, there's also going to be general continuity. Jokowi sought regional leadership for Indonesia. It's the largest, arguably the most powerful country in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. and they've sought Jokowi's sought a more significant leadership role. They've pursued the doctrine of what's called ASEAN centrality. That is the notion that ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, should emerge as its own geopolitical pole in the shaping multipolar world currently. To this end, they'll seek to create sort of a multilateral security structure within ASEAN, and not likely to succeed in this, particularly because no other ASEAN country is particularly enthusiastic about this idea. But Indonesia has been pushing it. Jokowi pushed it when Indonesia was the rotating chair of ASEAN in 2023. They even set up historic all ASEAN joint military drills for the first time. So this regional leadership and sovereignty and reducing dependence on foreign economies are all going to be consistent, and possibly, likely, even deepen under Prabowo.
If Jokowi is going to remain highly influential and involved, will there be associated political risk for Indonesia in the upcoming 5-year term, and what could those risks look like?
Yeah. Well, I did already touch on this a little bit. The main political risk is, broadly speaking, the erosion of democratic norms, democratic institutions, the blurring of the lines between the separation of powers, and of course they have the nepotistic element to this. So, down the line, I mean, in the short term, all of this has to sort of settle in place, plant itself, but down the road, we're going to have a proliferation of both Jokowi and Prabowo allies strategically placed throughout the entire system. As I mentioned, in the courts, in the legislature, among the business elite, in the military and intelligence circles. So we're seeing a shift basically away from established democratic norms and towards the personalistic influence that these two men have cultivated for themselves. Now, the risk, in addition to what I've mentioned, the structural risks, another one is that the two of them, their alliance breaks. I think that is likely, or will be more likely as time goes on. Dynamics change, developments in the world shift priorities. So the longer time goes on and the more the world sort of changes as time goes on, the less likely these two are to remain aligned, both on policy issues and on governance methods and on the direction of the country broadly. And because they're both so deeply entrenched systematically throughout the whole of the Indonesian system, there's high potential here for an eventual disintegration of the alliance, followed by a clash between the two power bases. So what you could see, this potential scenario, I don't want to say this is inevitable, but it's something that could very well happen, is you have, a split in the office of the presidency itself. You could have Jokowi trying to leverage his son, who will be the vice president, to influence Prabowo's policy. You could have Prabowo try to mitigate or eliminate the influence of Jokowi's sons and other allies in the system, and either of those two and a variety of other scenarios would, cause sort of a political hostility to arise between the two, a return to their previous status as rivals. Now, of course, you have that type of chaos in the upper echelons of the system. It can slow policy making. It can create policy contradictions. It can slow legislation. It can slow the issuance of regulations, create business uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, because policy will be pushed and pulled a variety of different directions depending on which individual has more influence in a particular situation. So that is a scenario. Again, it is not an inevitability, but it will become more and more likely as the 5-year term wears on, particularly if we have, status quo altering geopolitical events. Take the war in Ukraine, for example. If something like that were to occur that nobody is diligently forecasting for, this could change the priorities of these two individuals and cause them to go in separate directions, which will lead to an institutional, structural, political conflict within these systems that they've placed all of their people in. So to summarize, then we have the structural political risk just in terms of the erosion of the separation of powers between the three branches, and then the potential that will increase in likelihood over time of the two personalistic power bases of Jokowi and Prabowo eventually becoming antagonistic to one another.
You talked earlier about Subianto being more likely to take an assertive approach to foreign policy and national security. Does that mean we will be more likely to see heightened tensions with China over their territorial dispute? And could you kind of lay out the dispute? What other implications might there be to this augmented approach, such as with other regional Southeast Asian countries?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting aspect of Prabowo's policy, personality, even so. I'll use an example to illustrate the point here. In 2020, actually, before I do that, let me set the stage first. So China, as it has with a lot of Southeast Asian countries, has a territorial dispute, a maritime dispute with Indonesia in the Natuna Sea. So this is often folded into the larger South China Sea territorial dispute that China has with, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei. This is technically not part of that. The Natuna Sea is adjacent to the South China Sea, but they both fall within China's so-called 10-dash line, marking its maritime claiming basically the entirety of the South China Sea. So for all intents and purposes, the Natuna Sea and the Tuna Islands territorial dispute between Indonesia and China can be considered part of the broader South China Sea dispute. But technically it's not. So it's similar to the other maritime disputes that China has. But to illustrate the point I'd like to make, so in 2020, some Chinese fishing vessels and Coast Guard vessels entered the Indonesian exclusive economic zone in the Natuna Sea, which of course Indonesia claims as its own sovereign territory, and China claims the opposite or otherwise. And Prabowo, as defense minister, ordered a very assertive move. I mean, he sent out warships and fighter planes to chase off the Chinese vessels. And that might not sound too dramatic, given the incursion into what you consider your sovereign territory. But for a Southeast Asian leader, this is a very assertive move. It's much more assertive than is typical. It's more assertive than other Indonesian leaders have typically been towards China. And he's followed this up with rhetoric, and he followed that single instance up with regular patrols, naval patrols of the Natuna Sea. And this is also noteworthy because Southeast Asian countries typically like to use their coast guards, keep the intensity level below military when you use the Coast Guard. But Prabowo used the Navy, used the Air Force. So these are indications that, at least compared to his neighbors and his predecessors, he is more willing to deploy Indonesian military assets to contest China's claims. And moreover, this approach, at the time anyway, seems to have worked. So that example is illustrative of the extra just assertive potential that Prabowo brings to the Indonesian presidency. This doesn't mean that he will purposefully deepen tensions with China or pursue some sort of confrontation, but it does mean if China intensifies its presence in and around the Natuna Sea, then Indonesia is far more likely to respond with a relatively strong show of force, which also it implies just a general willingness to go further on this issue than again is typical of Southeast Asian leaders. So. In terms of other regional countries, other Southeast Asian countries, it will depend a great deal on their respective loyalties and associations and stances on the South China Sea dispute. Depending on the context and how it unfolds, countries like the Philippines and Vietnam could be very supportive of this sort of thing, establishing a stronger precedence to expel Chinese forces from claimed territory. But tensions with China are definitely not welcomed by all of Southeast Asia. Malaysia, Thailand are the big ones that would look on this with a bit of skepticism and caution and worry. And then smaller countries like Cambodia and Laos also would not be super supportive of this type of intensified assertiveness on Indonesia's part. But we can expect a stronger bid for regional leadership, geopolitical leadership, more outreach to other Southeast Asian countries for collaboration in national defense, drills, and the like, with this Natuna Sea territorial dispute in mind. So, these are all very interesting dynamics, and they will become, sort of moving pieces when Prabowo takes over, and a lot will depend on what China does. But these are some foreign policy tweaks. They're not inconsistent with Jokowi's policy, but they're more intensified and a higher likelihood of more assertive direct action.
So, I guess what does policy continuity, at least like initially, look like for Indonesia's economy?
Yeah. So I'll reiterate that it's a 5-year term. So in the first year, maybe 2 or 3, the policy continuity arrangement that the two, Prabowo and Jokowi, likely made with each other is likely to be quite strong. I mean, you will have strong policy continuity at first, in the first few years of the 5-year term, and so we can expect more protectionism. Resource nationalism. Prabowo and Jokowi are both big on agricultural improvements, sustainable agricultural technology, increasing the manufacturing productivity and capacity in Indonesia, investing in high-end technologies, but also with the mind to bring all of these supply chains into Indonesia eventually, piece by piece until you have the whole thing. So Prabowo will definitely continue on that general trajectory. But one of the major just development problems, one of the major burdens of an Indonesian leader is integrating the 6,000 inhabited islands of the archipelago with each other and with the capital. So these 6,000 islands, as you might imagine, some of them have radically different economic profiles, between them. Some are more developed than others. Some have, no infrastructure, very little, whereas others have more. One of the goals of Jokowi has been to spread economic development beyond the main islands of Java and Sumatra, where Jakarta is located. And into the less developed, far-flung eastern isles of the vast. Indonesia is a geographically vast country, and developing those outer provinces and outer islands is no easy task. It requires massive upfront investments in infrastructure, port infrastructure, maritime capacities, and those sorts of economic priorities will continue. Jokowi is also moving the capital city from Jakarta to the island of Borneo. This project has faced a lot of budgetary shortfals, planning mishaps, delays, and everything. It's been a slightly troubled project, and Prabowo has indicated that he will continue the move, although he's been less vocal about it. Has some observers speculating that he won't actually follow through. I believe he will. It seems like the new capital city, Nusantara, is moving along slowly. Jokowi is working from there currently in sort of a city under construction setting. So we'll see the continuation of the protectionist resource nationalism, food security. And let me touch on that a little bit more too, because Indonesia, given its vastness and its climate and its agricultural potential, could be a net food exporter, but because of structural constraints and the vastness and disjointedness of its geography, causing distribution problems, it's a net importer of food. So one thing Prabowo will do and this continues what Jokowi is trying to do is improve agricultural productivity to the point where Indonesia meets its potential and not only has enough foodstuffs to feed its population and efficiently distribute it, but possibly even to start exporting it. So they want to stop being a net importer of food. That'll be a big economic point. And then, just to summarize the economic development out into the Eastern Isles, infrastructure investments, and more protectionism. But so that does have trade-offs. That's beneficial to Indonesia's ambitions to, for example, become an electric vehicle battery manufacturing powerhouse by having every piece of that supply chain in country. And that will certainly be a lucrative venture given success. But it also will inhibit foreign investment in like the mining sectors, where exports of raw materials are heavily restricted, if not outright banned. You could see some revisions of foreign ownership limits, possibly requiring foreign investors to partner with state-owned enterprises in these sectors identified by the Indonesian government as critical. So you could there are pros and cons to this approach. The main benefit from Indonesia's perspective is moving up that manufacturing value chain, becoming an EV battery manufacturing powerhouse, and developing a strong sense of self-sufficiency. But on the other hand, it could alienate them in their trade relations, perhaps cause other countries to slap tariffs on some of their exports, reduce their export volume broadly. So these are the trade-offs that they're aware of and they're willing to accept. And this is a generally speaking strong policy continuity from Jokowi to Prabowo, at least in the first year or two of the new administration.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Nate.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks, Emma.
For more risk insights and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.